I watched the mosquito net rise, though no hand touched it, as if a breath from beneath pressed upward against the yellowed gauze. The kerosene lamp dimmed, its flame drawing thin and blue, and the night insects fell silent at once. From the rafters came the soft, wet sound of hair dragging along wood. Then the crying began above my head, thin as a needle, and the smell of rotting flowers filled the room. Men have urged me, over brandy and the years, to relate this business of Borneo and the woman in white, though I have long doubted the wisdom of stirring such waters. If you would hear more, lend me your patience, mark your thoughts below, and remember my name, for it may be all that remains of us. To understand how we came to that house on the Kapuas, and to the thing that we met there, I must return to the year 1909, and to Batavia, when my faith in reason still held. It began with a commission from the Royal Society in London, conveyed by cable and then by letter, requesting a modest ethnographic and botanical survey of the upper Kapuas River in western Borneo. I was then 30 years of age, a lecturer in comparative folklore at King's College, and more inclined to dismiss ghost stories than to record them. The Society wished catalogues of plant specimens, notes on Dayak ritual, and a report on native beliefs concerning death and the forest. We sailed from Batavia on the Dutch steamer Ophir on 3rd June 1909, bound for Pontianak at the mouth of the Kapuas. Our party numbered 4 Europeans. There was myself, Arthur Layton, nominally leader and charged with the folkloric observations. There was Henderson, a Scots botanist of taciturn manner and excellent rifle aim. There was young Merrick, barely 22, a surveyor from the War Office, seconded to map the upper reaches. Lastly, there was Dr. Charles Wilkes, an American physician whose interest in tropical diseases had drawn him eastward. Our equipment was standard for such ventures: 3 Lee Enfield rifles, 2 Webley revolvers, a brass theodolite, prismatic compasses, notebooks bound in oilskin, a small medicine chest, canvas tents, mosquito nets, entomological boxes, plant presses, and a crate of kerosene lamps and fuel. We carried also a folding field camera with glass plates, though the humidity would prove an enemy to its precision. Pontianak, in 1909, was a low, humid town of wooden houses on stilts, its streets half river and half mud. Dutch officials in white suits moved between the residency, the customs house, and their clubs, while Malay traders and Dayak boatmen crowded the wharves. The air smelt of sago, fish, and the sour sweetness of overripe fruit. Thunderheads rose each afternoon above the dark line of the interior. It was there that I first heard the word Pontianak spoken with any seriousness. Our interpreter and guide, a Malay named Ismail, who had worked with Dutch survey parties, mentioned it the second evening when we sat beneath the gallery of the small inn and watched lightning flicker inland. He was in his 30s, lean with a courteous reserve. "There are places upriver," he said, stirring his coffee, "where the people will not build houses. They say the Pontianak waits in the trees." I smiled and asked whether this creature was a tiger spirit or some jungle demon. He shook his head. "She is a woman, Tuan. A woman who died with anger in her womb. You will hear her before you see her. If you hear her close, she is far. If you hear her far, she is already beside you." Henderson snorted softly. "Every country has its banshee," he said. "We shall hear owls and call them Latin names." Only later would I understand that Ismail had been attempting in his own way to warn us. We left Pontianak on the 7th of June in 2 long, narrow prahus, each with 6 Dayak boatmen from the Iban people, hired by the residency. The Kapuas spread wide and brown beneath a low sky, its banks lined with nipa palms and mangroves, whose roots made a black tangle at the water's edge. The heat was a living thing that pressed upon the skull. At first, the journey possessed the usual hardships and small pleasures. We rose before dawn, broke camp by the faint light of hurricane lamps, and pushed against the current while mist clung to the river like breath upon glass. Merrick, who had never left England before, was eager and talkative. He spoke often of his fiancée in Surrey, producing a worn photograph of a young woman in a high-necked dress. One evening, about a week upriver, when the men had finished their rice and dried fish, Merrick and I sat by the embers while frogs called from the reeds. He turned the photograph in his hands, the firelight catching the silvering edges. "I mean to bring her out here one day," he said. "Once the maps are done and there is proper work for engineers. Imagine a house on a rise above the river with a veranda and a piano. She plays very well, you know. You are confident she would exchange Surrey for this damp furnace?" I said. He laughed. "She says she shall go wherever I go. Besides, there is something to be made out here, do you not think? A man might be the first to put his name on these blank spaces." I remember the way the smoke curled upward then, and the fire threw brief sparks into the darkness beyond the ring of light. The jungle pressed close, a black wall alive with unseen movement. I thought of all the tales I had read of men who brought their wives to the tropics, and of the fevers that took them, but I said nothing. It was that same night that I heard the first sound. I had risen to relieve myself before turning in. The camp was quiet, save for the low murmur of the boatmen and the endless insect chorus. As I stepped away from the firelight, there came from somewhere beyond the trees the faintest note of laughter. It was high and thin, like a child's, and yet wrong in some manner I could not then define. I paused, listening. The frogs continued, the river moved, the stars hung above like distant lanterns. The sound did not repeat. I returned to my blanket and made a note in my pocket diary that I had perhaps heard a nightjar or some unfamiliar bird. In the days that followed, the river narrowed and the forest grew taller and denser. Great buttress roots rose from the ground like the prows of ships. The air beneath the canopy was green and dim, filled with the drip of unseen water. We saw hornbills, their wings beating in slow, heavy strokes, troops of macaques. Once, the shadow of an orangutan moving through the branches like a rust-colored ghost. It was Henderson who first remarked upon the silences. One afternoon, as we paused to take bearings with the prismatic compass, the usual cacophony of cicadas ceased at once, as if some conductor had cut them off. The sudden quiet was almost a pressure against the ears. "Do you hear that?" Henderson said. "I hear nothing," I replied. "Just so," he said, frowning at the trees. "It is not natural." A moment later, the noise resumed, louder than before, and we laughed at ourselves. I wrote in my notes that the insects of Borneo appeared to sing in strange, coordinated bursts, and speculated that this might be due to some as yet unknown environmental cue. We first encountered the villagers at Nanga Semangut, a scattering of longhouses along a tributary that fed into the Kapuas from the north. The longhouses were built on high piles, their plank floors reached by notched logs. Smoke leaked from the eaves. and carved wooden figures stood at the entrances, their faces eroded by rain. The headman, an elderly Iban with tattoos across his shoulders, received us with courtesy after Ismail presented the residency's papers. We were offered rice wine in small cups and shown a place on the communal gallery where we might sling our hammocks. Here too, the word Pontianak surfaced, though more hesitantly. I had made a practice, in each settlement, of asking about beliefs concerning the dead. The Ibans spoke of souls that travelled along invisible paths, of omens in bird flight, of the necessity of proper burial lest a spirit wander. When I asked specifically about a woman's spirit angry in childbirth, there was a stir among the older women, and a glance passed between them and the headman. Ismail translated after a pause. They say such a woman becomes Antuponti. It is not good to speak her name at night. She waits in the trees for men who travel alone. What does she do? I asked, more curious than alarmed. The headman spoke, his voice low. Ismail's face tightened as he listened. He says she calls to them in the voice of their wives or their mothers. If they answer, she comes down. She smells like flowers left too long in the sun. She will ask to hold your child. If you say you have none, she will open you to see. The women muttered disapprovingly at this last, and the headman made a gesture as if to wipe the words from the air. I thanked him and recorded the tale carefully, noting the specific imagery of scent and voice. In my mind, I framed it as an expression of the dangers of the forest and of male anxiety regarding childbirth and female death. Had I understood then how much of this was not mere symbol, I might have turned back. We pushed on instead. For some days thereafter, nothing occurred that could not be ascribed to natural causes. There were leeches in abundance, and once a storm that came up the river with such force that we were obliged to pull the boats into the bank and lash them to trees while the rain fell in sheets. Merrick developed a fever that Wilkes treated with quinine. The boatmen muttered that we were nearing a stretch of river they called Sungai Sunyi, the Silent River, where, they said, certain trees grew that no man cut down. On the morning we entered that reach, the sky was a low pewter lid, and the air felt curiously heavy. The river here was narrower, its banks higher, and the overhanging branches met above in places to form a green tunnel. The usual calls of birds were absent. Our paddles dipped and rose with a muffled sound, as if the water itself were reluctant. "Barometer shows no change," Wilkes said, peering at the small aneroid he kept in a leather case. "Yet my ears feel as they do before a storm." The boatmen had grown quiet. One of them, a man with a wide scar across his cheek, wore a string of small charms around his wrist and touched them often. Ismail sat near the prow, his eyes on the banks. It was then that we saw the first tree. It stood alone upon a slight rise above the right bank, its trunk pale, almost white, and its branches hung with a profusion of long, narrow leaves. Around its base, someone had placed offerings: a small dish, a broken clay pot, a plait of dried leaves. The soil near its roots was bare, as if carefully kept clear. "That is a banyan of some sort, is it not?" I asked. Henderson shaded his eyes. "Ficus, certainly. The bark is unusually light, however. I have not its like in my specimens," the boatman murmured. One made a sign against evil. Ismail spoke without looking at me. "That is a Pontianak tree, Tuan. The place where she comes and goes. We should not stop here." I would later recall the way the air seemed cooler as we passed, and how the hair upon my arms rose though there was no breeze. At the time, I told myself that the tree had acquired its fearful reputation because of some poisonous insect or plant associated with it. I made a note to examine such a tree more closely when opportunity allowed. That opportunity came sooner than I expected. We camped that night on a small shingle of sand where the river widened briefly. The Pontianak tree, or one very like it, stood upon the opposite bank, its pale trunk ghostly in the failing light. The boatmen refused to cross to that side to cut firewood. Instead, they gathered fallen branches near our own camp and erected a ring of small charms about the perimeter. Superstition, Henderson muttered, though he permitted the charms, perhaps out of an unwillingness to quarrel with the men. As darkness fell, a thin mist rose from the river. We ate in subdued spirits. The usual talk of home and plans after the expedition did not arise. Even Merrick, whose fever had abated, seemed less inclined to speak of his Surrey girl. The first sound came just after the lamps had been lit. It was a woman's voice, or so I thought at first. A low, wavering cry that floated across the water from the direction of the pale tree. It was not words, but something like a drawn-out sob, rising and falling with a rhythm that set my teeth on edge. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. One of the boatmen dropped his tin plate. "Pontianak," he whispered. Wilkes stood, his face strained. "It is some bird," he said too quickly. "Perhaps a night heron." We all listened. The jungle beyond the opposite bank was a dark wall. The cry came again, a little higher this time, and then again, closer. The lamp flame flickered, though there was no discernible wind. "An owl," I said, though even as I spoke, I knew that no owl I had heard had such a human timbre. Ismail's hands shook where they rested on his knees. "We must not answer," he said. "If you call back, she will cross." The cry ceased. The silence that followed was immense. Even the insects seemed to hold their breath. The river made a slow sucking sound against the sand. Then, from somewhere deep in the trees behind us, there came a single, sharp sound, like a nail driven suddenly into wood. Merrick started to his feet. "Did you hear that?" The boatmen looked at one another, and one began to mutter under his breath. Henderson reached for his rifle and checked the magazine with a deliberate calm. We slept poorly that night. I lay in my hammock, watching the lamplight cast shadows upon the canvas of the tent, and listened for the cry. It did not return. Once, toward dawn, I thought I heard a soft scraping above me, as if something heavy dragged along the outer ridgepole. When I stepped outside with my revolver, the sky was paling, and a faint mist lay upon the river. Nothing moved upon the tent. I told myself that some nocturnal animal had passed, attracted by our food. The following day, we found the tracks. We had gone ashore to relieve ourselves and stretch our legs along a narrow strip of muddy bank. The soil there was soft and took impressions easily. I remember the smell of it, rich, damp, with a faint sourness where the river had recently receded. It was Merrick who noticed them first. "Arthur," he called, his voice oddly flat. "Come and look at this." In the mud, between our own boot prints and the marks of the boatmen's bare feet, there was a single, clear impression. It was the print of a small, naked foot, the toes splayed slightly, the arch high. It was that of a woman or a child, yet it lay several yards from the water's edge, in a place no one had passed since we had landed. The edges of the print were crisp, as if newly made. Wilkes crouched beside it, his spectacles sliding down his nose. He placed his own hand beside the print for scale. "Too small for any of us," he said. "Perhaps one of the men's wives came down in the night," I suggested, though I knew that none of the boatmen's women had accompanied us. Ismail shook his head slowly. "No one came," he said. "We were all by the fire." Henderson studied the surrounding mud. "There are no other prints leading to or from it," he said. "It is alone." He was correct. The solitary footprint stood in the smooth mud like a question. I felt then a faint unease that I could not wholly dismiss. Nevertheless, I took out my notebook and sketched the print, noting its approximate dimensions, and wrote that it might be the remnant of some older impression preserved by chance. I did not entirely believe myself. We pressed on, though the atmosphere of the party had changed. The boatmen spoke little and glanced often at the banks. At night, they built the fires higher and placed their charms more carefully. Ismail grew more withdrawn. When I asked him of his family in Pontianak, he answered in monosyllables and then turned the conversation. Only Merrick, whose youth made him resilient, attempted at first to maintain a semblance of normality. He joked about the footprint, suggesting that perhaps some jungle nymph had taken a liking to him. Yet I saw the way his eyes darted to the trees when the light failed. It was on the 12th day upriver that the thing occurred, which, even now, causes my hand to tremble when I set it down. We had halted at midday to take our bearings and to allow Henderson to collect specimens from a stand of unusual ferns. The sun beat down through a gap in the canopy and the air shimmered. The men had moved a little inland along a faint path, their machetes ringing softly as they cut. I remained near the boats with Wilkes and two of the boatmen, sorting specimens and checking the barometer. The river slid past, thick and opaque. Without warning, the compass needle in my hand began to tremble. At first, I thought it was some trick of my grip, but as I steadied the instrument, the needle swung erratically, veering several degrees east, then west, then spinning a full circle before settling in a position that bore no relation to our known orientation. "Wilkes," I said, "look at this." He bent over the compass, his brow furrowing. "The magnet must be damaged," he said, though he had inspected it only that morning. One of the boatmen, seeing our expressions, murmured something to his companion. They both turned their faces toward the forest, listening. Then the sound came. It was as if a woman laughed very softly just behind my left ear. I spun, heart hammering, but there was no one there. The riverbank was empty, the boats rocking gently. The laughter had been intimate, almost playful, and yet beneath it there had been a note of hunger that made my stomach clench. Wilkes had gone pale. "Did you hear that?" he asked. "The men," I began, but the boatmen were staring at us, their eyes wide, clearly having heard nothing. Before I could answer, there was a sudden, sharp crack from within the forest, followed by a shout. Then another crack, like a branch breaking, and a cry that cut off abruptly. Henderson burst from the undergrowth, his face streaked with sweat and something darker. He held his rifle in one hand, the barrel bent at an impossible angle, as if some great force had struck it. "Back to the boats," he gasped. "Now!" "What has happened?" Wilkes demanded. "Where is Merrick?" I asked, for the boy was not with him. Henderson's eyes met mine, and in them I saw something that chilled me more than any sound. It was not merely fear, it was bewilderment. "He was beside me," he said. "There was a smell, like jasmine left to rot. Then something moved above us. The branch came down. I saw his hat roll. I did not see him. We crashed into the trees, calling Merrick's name, but the boatmen hung back, muttering, and Ismail, who had just returned from the ferns, seized my arm. "No further, Tuan," he said. "If she has taken him, you will not find him. You will only give her more." I shook him off and pushed on a few yards, my boots slipping in the leaf mold. The air was thick, and there was indeed a smell, cloying and sweet, that seemed to cling to the back of my throat. Above, the leaves stirred, though no breeze moved. We found Merrick's hat, crushed and stained, lying beside a fallen branch that was too large to have been dislodged by any ordinary means. The ground around it was disturbed, but there were no clear tracks, no drag marks, nothing that suggested the passage of a body. It was as if he had stepped out of the world. At that moment, a cloud passed over the sun, and the light dimmed. The jungles seemed to draw closer. Somewhere, far off, a woman began to wail. We retreated to the boats. The hours that followed were a tangle of argument and stunned silence. Henderson blamed himself, insisting that he should have kept Merrick in sight. Wilkes, pale and sweating, spoke of concussion, of the possibility that Merrick had wandered dazed into the forest. "We must search," he said. "He may be lying injured within earshot." The boatmen refused. "The Pontianak has taken him," one said flatly. "We will not go into her trees." I tried to assert authority, to insist upon a systematic search, but my words felt thin even as I uttered them. The memory of the laughter at my ear and the erratic compass lay upon my mind like a weight. In the end, we compromised. Henderson and I, with Wilkes, went a short distance along the path, calling until our throats were raw. The forest absorbed our voices. Once, I thought I heard an answer, a faint cry that might have been my name, but when we turned toward it, there was only the endless green. We found no trace of Merrick beyond the hat and the fallen branch. That night, we camped in a tight knot upon a narrow island of gravel midstream at the insistence of the boatman, who said that the water might keep certain things at bay. They lashed the boats together and built a low platform upon which we spread our blankets. The river hissed and gurgled around us. No one spoke of Pontianak, but the word hung unspoken in the damp air. I lay awake, watching the stars wheel above, and thought of Merrick's Surrey girl, of the piano on the imagined veranda. I saw again the solitary footprint in the mud, the bent rifle, the pale tree. My rational mind groped for explanations. A falling branch, a concussion, an animal, yet each piece sat ill with the others. Toward midnight, the temperature dropped abruptly. The sweat upon my skin cooled and I shivered. The insects ceased their song. The river itself seemed to hold its breath. From the darkness along the bank there came a gentle splashing as of someone wading. Then a voice, low and familiar, called, "Arthur!" For a moment my heart leapt. It was Merrick's voice, with its boyish lilt sounding tired and relieved. "Arthur, help me. I am here." I rose to my elbows, every instinct urging me to answer, to seize a lamp, to go to him. My mouth opened. Across the platform, Ismail's hand shot out and gripped my wrist with surprising strength. His eyes were wide and white in the starlight. "Do not answer," he whispered. "Whatever you hear, do not answer." The voice came again, closer. "Arthur, why will you not speak to me?" There was a note of hurt in it that cut me. It was not merely similar to Merrick's voice. It was his voice, down to the slight catch on my name. Yet beneath it, as with the earlier laughter, there was something else, a resonance that did not belong in any human throat. Wilkes had sat up, his face drawn. Henderson gripped his rifle, though what use a bullet would have been, I do not know. The splashing ceased. For a few heartbeats, there was only the faint creak of the boats. Then, from directly above us, so close that the hairs on my scalp rose, there came a sound like long hair sliding slowly over wood. I could not move. I could scarcely breathe. The smell of rotting flowers thickened until I gagged. Something brushed the top of the mosquito net above my face, pressing down as if a hand, or a head, leaned upon it from outside. The gauze dipped, then rose, then dipped again, in a slow, curious manner, as if whatever lay above were testing the barrier. In that moment, I understood why the villagers had spoken of her as a woman, and not a beast. I do not know how long it lasted. Time stretched. My muscles ached from remaining so rigid. At last, the pressure lifted. The smell receded, though it did not vanish entirely. The hair sound moved away along the ridgeline of the boats, then downward, then was gone. The insects resumed their chorus in a ragged burst. The river sighed. No one spoke until dawn. We left that place as soon as there was sufficient light to see the banks. The boatmen paddled with a frantic energy, their eyes fixed ahead. Henderson sat in the bow, his jaw set, the bent rifle beside him like a broken promise. Wilkes muttered to himself, fragments of prayer and physiology intermingled. As for myself, I felt as if some inner compass had been wrenched from its mounting. The world no longer seemed entirely solid. Every shadow between the trees suggested a white figure. Every eddy on the river's surface might conceal a pale hand. We did not speak of returning to search for Merrick again. The decision lay unvoiced among us, heavy as lead. In my notebook, I wrote only that Mr. Edward Merrick was lost in the forest on 19th of June 1909, presumed killed by a falling branch. The words looked thin and false upon the page. The journey downriver took 3 days, though it felt longer. We stopped only when absolutely necessary, and then for the briefest of intervals. The usual hardships of such travel, the insects, the heat, the cramps in the arms, were now overlaid with a constant low hum of dread. On the second day, as we rounded a bend, we passed again one of the pale trees. This time, I saw, or believed I saw, something hanging among its branches. At first, I took it for a tattered piece of cloth caught upon a limb. It was white, and it stirred slightly, though there was no wind. As we drew nearer, I saw that it was not cloth, but hair. Long black hair that fell in a curtain from some point high in the tree, swaying gently, its ends not quite touching the ground. I squinted, trying to discern the form to which it belonged, but the leaves obscured all. The hair itself seemed to drink the light. "Do not look," Ismail said sharply. "Keep your eyes on the water." I obeyed, though not before I thought I saw between two leaves a flash of something pale, like a face turned away. That night, we begged the boatmen to moor near a village rather than upon an isolated bank. They agreed, perhaps as eager as we for human company. We arrived at a small Malay settlement just after dusk, our approach announced by the barking of dogs. The villagers received us with wary courtesy. They saw at once that one of our number was missing, and their eyes lingered on the bent rifle and on the hollows beneath our eyes. We were given a corner of a stilted house in which to sling our hammocks. The floor was of split bamboo, the air thick with the smell of cooking oil and damp wood. It was there, in that house, that the moment with which I began this account occurred. The rising of the mosquito net, the dimming of the lamp, the hair sound in the rafters. The villagers, when questioned the next morning, insisted that they had heard nothing. A few charms had been found at the base of the house's supporting posts, as if someone had placed them there in haste during the night. No one admitted to having done so. We reached Pontianak on 24th June. The town, with its familiar smells and its clatter of carts, seemed at once blessedly solid and strangely insubstantial, as if it might vanish like mist should I look away. The Dutch resident received us in his office, a high-ceilinged room with shuttered windows and a large map of Borneo upon the wall. He was a thick-set man with a neat beard and an expression of habitual skepticism. "You have returned early," he remarked, glancing at the calendar, "and you are one short." I laid Merrick's hat upon his desk. "Mr. Merrick was killed by a falling branch," I said. The lie came more easily than I had expected, perhaps because it contained a sliver of truth. "Unfortunate," the resident said, his tone suggesting that such misadventures were common enough in his jurisdiction. "You will provide a full report, of course. The society will expect an accounting." In the days that followed, as we waited for a steamer to Batavia, I set myself to the task of composing that report. It was then that the true difficulty began. How was I to reconcile what I had seen and heard with the expectations of a learned body that prized reason above all? To speak of errant compass needles, solitary footprints, disembodied voices, and hair upon the ridges of boats would be to invite, at best, indulgent smiles, and, at worst, professional ruin. In the end, I wrote of the flora and fauna with exactitude. I described the Iban rituals with care, noting their belief in an Antu Ponti, a female revenant associated with childbirth and the forest. And I framed this as a valuable example of a widespread Southeast Asian motif. I recorded Merrick's death as an accident, occasioned by a falling limb during a botanical excursion. I mentioned the reluctance of the boatman to approach certain trees and suggested that these might harbor venomous creatures. Nowhere did I write of the voice that had called my name upon the river, or of the pressure upon the mosquito net. The official report was well received. The Royal Society's secretary wrote to commend the thoroughness of my observations, and a brief notice appeared in the Times, lamenting the loss of a promising young surveyor to the perils of the tropics. There was no mention of Pontianak. Privately, however, I could not let the matter rest. In Batavia, before my return to Europe, I sought out a Dutch physician who had served many years in the Indies and who had published a monograph on tropical neuroses. I described, in general terms, a case in which several men had experienced similar auditory hallucinations in the jungle, accompanied by olfactory phenomena and transient disturbances of magnetic instruments. He listened gravely, then suggested that heat, humidity, and anxiety might produce such effects, particularly in men unaccustomed to the climate. He spoke of sunstroke, of malaria's cerebral manifestations, of the suggestibility of groups under stress. "These natives," he said, "have a rich folklore. It is only natural that you and your companions, hearing their tales, might experience something akin to them. The mind is a powerful projector." His explanation was reasonable. It soothed, for a time, the more jagged edges of my memory. Yet at night, in my room at the Hôtel des Indes, when the electric fan turned slowly overhead and the geckos clicked upon the walls, I would wake with the sensation of hair brushing my face and with the smell of rotting jasmine in my nostrils. No fever accounted for that. Years passed. I returned to London, resumed my lectures, published articles on Malay and Dayak belief. I married in time, though not the woman I had once imagined, and I fathered a daughter whose first cry in the hospital brought tears to my eyes. Life, in its obstinate way, went on. Yet Borneo did not wholly release me. On damp summer evenings, when the air in Bloomsbury hung heavy and the chestnuts in Russell Square exhaled their green scent, I would sometimes hear, beneath the rattle of cab wheels, a faint, wavering cry that set my teeth on edge. In lecture halls, when I spoke of the Pontianak as a figure of myth, an example of the female revenant in Southeast Asian lore, I felt at times as if I mouthed a half-truth, and that something in the far forests listened, amused. Once, in 1913, a letter reached me from Wilkes, written on thin paper from a hospital in New York. He had returned to America shortly after our expedition and had gone on to serve in various capacities. His hand, always neat, now shook slightly in the looping script. "Do you ever hear her?" he wrote without preamble. I have tried to tell myself that it was fever, that we were all unwell. But sometimes, when the wind comes down the Hudson in a certain way, I hear a woman call my name from the water in a voice that is almost my mother's and almost not. I think of Merrick then, and I cannot sleep. I replied, offering what comfort I could, though I admitted more in that letter than I had ever spoken aloud. Whether it reached him, I do not know. The war came soon after, and I heard that he died in a field hospital in France of influenza. In 1921, at a conference in Leiden, I met a Dutch ethnographer who had worked among the Malays and Dayaks of Kalimantan. Over coffee in a high, cold room lined with books, he mentioned, as if in passing, that there had been, some years prior, a small rash of disappearances among timber workers along a certain stretch of the Kapuas. Men had gone into the forest to fell trees and had not returned. Their comrades spoke of a woman in white who had been seen in the branches above, her hair hanging down like lianas. I asked, as casually as I could, whether there had been any physical evidence. He shrugged. One man's shirt was found high in a tree, torn as if by claws. Another's cap lay in the mud beside a single footprint. But you know how stories grow around such things. The company blamed tigers or headhunters. The locals spoke of Pontianak. It is always the same. That night, in my lodging, I lay awake, turning his words over. A single footprint, a cap in the mud. The pattern repeated, like a motif in a piece of music. I began then a private collection of notes, separate from my professional work. In it, I gathered every reference I could find to the Pontianak, the Kuntilanak of Java, the Langsweer of the Malay Peninsula. Old colonial reports, missionary letters, native tales, even sailors' yarns. Again and again, certain elements recurred. The woman dead in childbirth, the tree by the water, the smell of flowers turned foul, the voice that called in the tones of the beloved. If it were only story, it was a remarkably consistent one. There were nights when I almost convinced myself that the Pontianak was nothing more than a personification of very real dangers, of fever, of the perils of childbirth, of the forest that could swallow a man without trace. There were other nights when I woke with my heart pounding, and the conviction, as solid as the mattress beneath me, that something had leaned over my bed and listened to my breathing. My daughter, when she was small, would sometimes wake crying, saying that a lady with long hair had stood by her window. We lived then in a narrow house in Bloomsbury, far from any jungle, the only trees the plane trees in the street. I told her it was a dream or a shadow, and I believed it. I had to. Once, in 1927, I passed a florist's shop on a hot day. A crate of jasmine had been left too long in the sun, and the flowers had begun to spoil. The smell rose in a wave as I walked by, sweet and corrupt. For a moment, the London street vanished. I was back on the Kapuas, the river a black ribbon, the hair sound above my head. My legs went weak, and I had to grip a lamppost until the world steadied. I have sometimes wondered whether we might have saved Merrick had we done something differently. If we had heeded the boatman sooner, or if we had turned back at the first footprint, would he now be an engineer in Surrey with children of his own? Or was his fate sealed the moment we set eyes upon the pale tree? Such questions have no answer. They gnaw nonetheless. In the decades since, I have seen the maps of Borneo fill with lines and names. Places that were once blank are now crisscrossed with roads, dotted with towns. Timber companies have cut deep into the forests. Missions have risen where longhouses stood. The world, we tell ourselves, is known. Yet there remain, even now, pockets of shadow on those maps, places where the rivers run slow beneath overhanging branches and where certain trees are not cut. In those places, I believe, the Pontianak still waits, patient as only the dead can be. I have come, in the end, to accept that some experiences resist tidy explanation. Perhaps what we encountered on the Kapuas was, in part, a projection of our own fears, shaped by the tales we had heard. Perhaps some natural phenomenon, as yet unclassified, disturbed our instruments and our senses. Or perhaps, as the old Iban headman said, there are indeed spirits that slip between the leaves and call to men in the voices of those they love. What troubles me most, after all these years, is not the laughter at my ear, nor the sight of hair in the trees, nor even the memory of Merrick's voice upon the dark water. It is a smaller thing. On certain nights, when the house is quiet and the city's hum has sunk to a distant murmur, I lie awake and listen. The bed is firm beneath me, the familiar creaks of the old beams above. My wife breathes softly at my side. From somewhere, a clock strikes the hour, and then, just as I am slipping towards sleep, there is a faint, almost imperceptible weight upon the blanket over my feet, as if something light has settled there. The fabric depresses a fraction, then lifts, then depresses again in that same slow, curious manner I felt once through a mosquito net on a river in Borneo. When I open my eyes, there is nothing to see. There is only the lingering scent of flowers that have been kept too long in a warm room, and the certainty that far away in some damp green place, she has not forgotten my name.